Hi and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video I'm going to talk about politicians and compliance because I got a question. Are politicians required to comply? Well, it depends. Let's just look at the type of politicians we have. If we just take it broadly, we have two types of politicians, those in governments and those without power. So if we just start without any power interfering in the compliance complexity, so politicians in general, without the power. What are politicians? So politicians should represent a part of the public. They do that on the basis of some core values and ideology, and they have to behave according to what they have promised the public, or at least their voters. Otherwise, they might end up being a part of a big scandal. So politicians need to align their own behavior with the expectations from their voters, and the voters have voted on them because of statements, arguments that these politicians have brought out, disclosed about their own core values and preferences that they will fight for. It could be wealth distribution, different elements in society. So, and if they don't behave accordingly to what they've been stating, well, then they might not get voted in again. But are there actually liability? Well, not in general, because politicians can say a lot of stuff without actually. You cannot go to court typically just on a statement or a preference. So we still have this lack of enforceability when it comes to general politicians. As an example, I just put out here a complex ideology that in Denmark we work with. It's called the equalization reform. It means that wealthier municipalities, we distribute some of the wealth to the lesser wealthier municipalities to even out kind of a socialistic way of driving our welfare state. So we had this example where our prime minister went out increasing the distribution of wealth. At the same time, at the EU level, we saw that she refused to enhance the distribution of wealth from our own country to other countries. So this turned into be like a complex situation in terms of ideology and political statement or preference, because if you believe in an equalization reform, shouldn't you be doing it at national level too, between member states in the EU? Well, not if you have a nationalistic preference. So you only regard that this is necessary within your own borders. So that disclosed something. She had to acknowledge that because that was a part of her preference scheme. So not all politics, even though you have like one ideology or one preference at one place, might turn out different when you take it to the international level. And of course, politicians need to be able to argue their way around such a complex situation. Otherwise, they will end up in a scandal. So that was just an example of a complex situation when we talk about ideology and politics. So what about politicians in power? Well, when we talk about politicians in government, enforceability becomes actually tangible because ministers have liability, governments have liability. And this is typically why you would have the experience that when politicians are voted in government, they kind of change their, not aggressiveness, but their statements become lesser controversial because now they have to align their political statements with the operation and the authorities of that country and the laws. So typically we would see that politicians kind of like decrease the element of being controversial when they go into government, simply because they now are liable in terms of what they do, especially if they have a large post, become a minister or equivalent. So when we talk about this, it is funny to regard this in a spectrum of politicians, because we all know that politics, typically we talk about politics being from far left to far right, and where are you on that like kind of continuum. So the far left and the far right would rarely be in power on long term, at least, because they simply cannot keep being compliant with their old statements, what they got voted in government for. Because at the same time, the further out you are on the continuum, the more controversial, and typically the law operates in kind of a median, if you regard it as a continuum. So far left, far right will have a problem staying in government on a long term because they simply cannot comply with their own statements. Especially when we talk about international law, when we have member state requirements from EU level regulation, etc. So you might have parties that are anti-EU within the European Union. They will rarely stay in government for decades, because then the voters would go to a party maybe even further right, because the party in government has not complied. They haven't done what they initially stated they would do, fight against the EU. We could have a lot of examples, but it's good to see that politicians typically operate around the middle. What the far left and far right can do is they can move the middle to some extent. And we also see that movement across the European Union. When we have large immigration crisis, we typically see a movement to the right against immigration. We put up a lot of new immigration policies, laws, etc. And there we see that the middle will change, but it is rare that the far right, far left can stay compliant on long term. So this was just a small dive in to answer the questions: are politicians required to comply? They are when they're in government, but typically they are only obliged as long as the voters will not neglect them for the next election, or if they don't really care about re-election. So stay tuned, subscribe to this channel, and let's talk more about compliance.